Hello and welcome to Section 3, where we're going to be talking about fleshing out the gameplay systems. Now in the previous section, Section 2, where we talked about prototyping games, we went into really rough, kind of dirty code in order to quickly get results so that we could see how things work in the game. Now in Section 3, we're going to talk about how we create decoupled systems that are a little bit cleaner and have more of a production quality to them. So for starters, we're going to talk about stat system. And then in the next video, we're going to talk about how we implement that stat system using our decoupled input system. Let's not get too lost in that. Let's just jump into what the stat system looks like and what I mean when I talk about a stat system. So hop over here to Unity for a second, and there's a few things I want to draw your attention to. This may look very familiar, the scene, to what we've been working in, but in fact it is a copy of the prototype scene. So I've made a new folder here called Sandbox, and inside Sandbox I have a new set of scenes. This one here happens to be a copy of the other one, albeit I've made a few changes to it. And then I have a folder here called Player Controller inside of the Rogue Smash folder. So this is code that is, although cleaner, is still specific to this game. It's not portable. I can't just copy it anywhere in its current state. So there are a few things here. There's a data folder where I just have a scriptable object, and I'll go over what that is. And then we have a scripts folder where I have two things, a character data class and a character data template class. Now, let's open character data and take a look at what it is. All right, so inside here I have my class, and you can see that I've moved it into the Rogue Smash namespace. And this class is a vanilla C# class. It doesn't derive from anything. And, it's basically a data container. It has private float for movement speed, int for max health, int for max lives, and then some accessors to get at those private methods. Another thing you may notice here is that I'm using the serializable attribute at the top. So just make sure that in the inspector I can see all the serialized values. And a new thing that we're sort of using here is this header attribute. So the header attribute actually it creates a label basically that separates sections of member variables in the inspector. So I've created one header here for movement and another one here for health. And if I go back to Unity, you'll see that if I select this scriptable object, I can see the header here, movement and health. And don't worry, we'll get into this in a second. Okay, so back to my class, that's all it does. It contains data. And then my character data template is a container for that. And the reason I wrap it like that is there's a couple of reasons. One is that this character data class doesn't have to be inside of a scriptable object. I could, for example, pull this information from the internet in the form of like a JSON object or an XML object or some other binary form. But for the purposes of this game, I'm going to have it all baked into my game, and it makes sense to use Unity scriptable object. So Unity scriptable object is very similar to a mono behavior, but it allows us to build assets from these scriptable objects. Now, in the past, you had to sort of make this a script for every single one or write your own sort of generic script to generate the asset. But now Unity create asset attributes. And there's a couple of fields that you need to pass into it. One is the file name. So when it creates a new asset from this scriptable object, what is it going to be called? So by default, it's going to be called new character data template, as you can see here. The second thing it's going to ask you for is a menu name. So this is the name of the menu where you're going to find the option to create this file. So it'll be under My Company, Data, Create Character Data Template. So let's go to Unity and see what that looks like. Okay, so here in Unity, I have my assets, create menu, and I see this folder here for My Company, Data, and I have a couple of things here, but the first one here is the character data template. And if I click on that, it's going to create one for me right here in the selected folder, and it just gives it a default name, and I can call it ABC or whatever. And there we go. Now we have an asset that stores all the data that we define inside of that container class. So I'll go ahead and delete that now. Okay. And let's go back to our code. So that's it. Essentially, we have a serialized field here that contains the character data so that we display this character data class inside of it. I have another example of this. One is basically data for the weapon. So let's go to that. So I have my weapons folder here inside of Unity, and this ties into the weapon system a little bit more than it does into the stat system. But the important thing here is that my weapon data uses a very similar design paradigm. I have weapon data, which is a vanilla C# class. And as you can see here, it's in the namespace, Rogue Smash, weapons, and I'll like to drive that home. But it's a vanilla C# class. Same thing, we're using headers to divide up the fields or at least how they're displayed in the inspector. We have a few things here about our weapons. So general characteristics, for example, how much is the max ammo it would have? What's the minimum fire interval? What's our reload time? Blah, blah, blah. We have a few different things here, and we expose those with properties again, just to keep things consistent. So the second thing we have is the weapon data container, or sorry, the template. And I'll open that up. And similar to what we had before, all it is a scriptable object. It creates a menu for me, the one we saw just a second ago, and it's just going to create a scriptable object that contains some weapon data inside of it. And it's pretty straightforward. I have this weapon data template, and I have this data folder with a pistol inside of it, and it has all these fields filled out. Now, we're going to talk about this a little bit later on in terms of what we do with this data in the input section, but for now I just want to make sure you understand the concept here. So you can do this from the context menu here as well. If I right click, create, again, my company data, and I have weapon data and character data. So same as we did with the character data, I can create a new one with a default name. All these values are initialized to the default values, and I can rename it if I want to or not. I'll delete that for now. And there's one last thing I want to point out here. You could take this even further if you wanted to. And instead of using a class, you could use a struct. Now, there are several differences between classes and struct. Most importantly, you cannot derive from a struct. With that said, though, struct is much more efficient in terms of memory. So if you wanted to reduce allocations and that sort of thing, you might want to go with structs instead of classes, especially when there's very little reason to use a class, as we have here. I'll leave that up to you, but we'll leave this as a class for now, and then we'll wrap it up.